Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to go through the basics of creating a displacement map and how we can utilize that within Keyshot. So I'm going to use this software called JSplacement. You can download this online. So type in JSplacement into Google and this first link will windmill art is where we can download it. So portable executable is the one where you can put it onto a memory stick and you can load this anywhere. If you want to install it onto your computer, then you can download the installer and install it. I like to use the portable executable one because I can use it on any machine, so I can use it at the uni PCs as well. So go ahead and download that and then launch it. So now we're in the software. You can select these little gridded icons in the top left corner. And let's go to JSplacement 2 just so we can see how this works. So if I press generate, it's going to randomly generate these sci-fi shapes and we can use these as our displacement map. So the brighter areas of the image are going to be raised on the geometry and you'll see this soon. So we've got our classic set, we've got our nicely named crap pack which has an assortment of lots of different shapes. We've got big data and AgroMax. So we've got a lot of kind of PC component sci-fi shapes that we can work with. I actually quite like this AgroMax. I'm interested in seeing how this would look. So I might just keep it like this. We can also change the background brightness. We can change how many iterations we have of that design, background iterations, and sprite scale. I actually quite like how this looks, so I might not change any of these settings. But you can play around with these sliders and see what effect you can get. So I'm going to save this displacement map. So I'm going to say save height. And I'm going to save this here. So I'll call this Sci-Fi height. And I'll save this here. And then we need to go into Maya and we need to create a flat plane. So I'll just delete this flat plane. And then we'll make it the size of the grid. And then we need to go to polyplane 1 and increase the subdivision width and height. So I might just bump this up to about 300 by 300. If the PC isn't as fast, then you could do 200 by 200. It's a little bit safer. You could even go up to 500 depending on what PC you are using. So let's export this. File, export selection. And we'll name this plane underscore 2 export selection, and then we'll go into Keyshot and we'll import our new flat plane. So it needs to be dense so that it can raise this geometry out of that flat plane. So I'm going to load this plane, import. I'm then going to go onto my materials and just place a new material on there. It seems to be a little bit slow. There we go. We can go to paint, drag and drop a matte material, for example, and then we'll start adding our displacement map. So we're going to go into our material. We're going to double click on our new matte material. We're going to load the material graph. Okay, so if I go into my height map folder, I'm going to drag and drop this new height map that I've downloaded. Doesn't seem to have changed the name, but there we go. There it is. And we need to hook this up to the geometry. So we need to change some of these settings. We need to right click here and select geometry and displace. And then we need to set the displacement map to the displace node and then displace up to geometry. So we're not going to see how this works yet until we double click on displace to bring up the settings. And we need to change some of these settings here. Now, I don't know why the displacement height is set to 100 millimeters by default because it's really high. Ideally, we need to set this to something like 2 and then execute geometry node. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we can see the displacement map is now interacting with the flat plane and it's raising that geometry. Okay, very cool. So if you want even more details, then you can select triangle size in pixels and then execute geometry. And then it's going to add a lot more detail. There we go. An awful lot more detail there. That's looking pretty good. If you want to raise it even more, then we can change this height. So let's say we change this to about 5, and then again, execute geometry node. And as you can see, it's already starting to look like a really cool sci-fi environment. So I might just raise this up just a little bit more. Let's do 6mm, execute geometry node. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so I'll close that, and I'm going to use this. Now, if you want to change the material, you don't just drag and drop the material onto it. If you do that, it's going to remove the displacement. So I'm just going to undo that with Control Z. You need to double click on the material, go to Material Graph, and you need to delete this paint because this is the painting preference into the map material. So let's say, for example, we wanted a metal material. Let's try something like this. Okay, so you can hover over, but don't let go, just so you can see what it would look like. Yes, that's quite cool. Let's have a look at this one. It's a little bit too dark. Nope. Okay, so just experiment with them. I think I prefer this one. So what you want to do is you want to drag it onto your material graph instead. So we're going to just move these to the side. I'm going to delete this original paint material and then just hook this up to surface of the original paint matte gray. Okay, so we've got our displacement map hooked into geometry, and we've got our new texture into surface. So let's just add a new environment. You can download different environments online through websites like HDRI Haven. If you download new ones, you just select this little folder here with this arrow, and you can import new ones, and it imports it straight into our menu. So already that's looking pretty cool. I like the way the light is kind of reflecting off the surface. So I might just keep this one. So I'm going to go into environment and just hide the background there. I don't want that anymore. So I'm going to select color, and let's just select a base background color for now. We can always just change this in Photoshop. You can go down to black if you want to easily edit that photo in Photoshop. Let's just do like a dark gray for now. Okay. Now, if we want any depth within this scene, then we can add a cube in the scene, and anything that's within that cube is going to have a dense scattering medium. So anything within that cube is going to have a fog, essentially. So we need to push some of these volumes back into the background. You don't have to do this. You can do this entirely within Photoshop. But the way I like to do it is I like to go to Edit, Add Geometry, and then add a cube. Okay. And then we can rotate this just so we can see the front of that flat face. I'm going to go to Scale and then scale this out. So make sure it's covering the entire scene. Okay, and then I'm going to scale this up. Okay, so anything that's within this box is going to be fogged. We can do that by going to Material and then Scattering Medium. And I think I just jumped ahead there. If you press the tick, once you've moved it, then it will accept that box. So we're going to go to Scattering Medium and then drag and drop this new Scattering Medium onto our cube. We're then going to go to Materials and double click on Scattering Medium. We just need to change some of these settings. So I'm going to change the density, and I'm going to change the transparency distance. So I'm going to move this down. So make slight changes and see how it looks first before you move all of these sliders all the way down. So let's have a look. It's looking a bit better. Let's increase density slightly. There we go. Okay, so I've got this set to 32 by 4. We can always just change this 32 by 4 just to keep it consistent. And you can also change the color of that fog. So we could have a slight blue tint. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. So all of the dots you're seeing, this is rendering within real time. So it's going to take a while to render this entire scene. But as soon as we render this, we can go grab a coffee, let it render, come back, and then we can start painting into this in Photoshop. So you can either render it this way. You've already got the lighting scenario there, which is perfect. You can add your lights into Photoshop by using something like a screen light or an overlay. But you can also add the lights within the scene. Now this is a little bit abstract, but it can still be done. So let's just double click on the metal material and go to the material graph. And we're going to change this surface. So we could go to textures instead of the material graph. And you'll notice that the base color is currently blanked out. So we don't actually have a base color. We can click on this base color and choose something like a city light scene. So I've got this image here that I've downloaded online. I'm unsure whether this one's going to work. I don't know how it's going to look. I haven't tested it yet. But this is an example of an image that I could use. So let's double click on this and see what happens. Okay, so we've already got a little bit of color information here. I mean, this is really nice, this little red accent here on the building. And that's all for free, right? All of that little bit of information there is all for free. You can now put it into Photoshop and then start painting into it. The great thing I love about 3D is it can be random. Yeah, and those random results can actually be really cool. Sometimes when you're painting in Photoshop, you're trying to be very precise. And it can look a little bit stagnant, a little bit boring. 3D, fantastic. We can randomize this. So I'm really liking these kind of little red accents here. It's almost a shame for me to start moving these sliders because I really like this bit here. But I'll show you as an example. We can change the width and we can bring this down if we want the image size to be much smaller. And this is just tiling the entire image across the entire 3D model, right? So it is going to be totally random every time that you move these sliders or any kind of new image that you apply to the 3D model. So let's just move these down. Now this image is really small. Let's move it back up. So yeah, even this little detailing here is very cool. This is quite nice. So experiment, use different images and see what you can come up with just by applying this image to the model. So that's the base color. I'm not going to add a bump. I don't want any textures or any raised textures on this model. So I'm going to keep it as is for now. I might just undo just so I can get that red bit back. I really liked that. Okay, so that's it. That is how we can render this. I'm now going to go into my lighting. It's currently set to basic, so I can set this to something like a product render or an interior render. There's going to be an awful lot more detail when you render it this way. It's sometimes best to just select the lighting scenario and then just wait and see what it looks like before you render, because sometimes the interior and the product settings are just a little bit different and it can light your scene slightly differently from the original basic render. So just give it a while, see what it looks like. If you're happy with it, then render it. I think for now the product looked a little bit better. There's a little bit dense on the fog section here. Of course, we can make any kind of adjustments. We can move this around. We could go to a top view if you wanted a bird's eye view. And like I've said before, if you imagine you were painting this and you had to draw this scene, it's going to take you so long. Just being able to use these 3D models and using these displacement maps, it's going to be so much easier to create these kind of environments. Okay, so we can now go to render and we can name this. So let's do city lights. Let's save this in our folder. And then we'll set the resolution. So I've got the preset set to 1080. So this is the same aspect ratio of my monitor. You can set it higher 2K, 3K, 4K. For now I'm going to keep it at 1080. You can also go into the options here, and I've set the sample rate a little bit higher. I think by default it's set to about 80, I believe. Might even be a little bit lower, might be at 64. So I've just set this to 160. We've got a lot more samples to work with, which is going to remove some of that grain that's within the image. So we can go ahead and press render, and then I'm going to pause this video and show you the final result. Right, so now I've put this into Photoshop. I've got a nice render of our scene. I've just downloaded some images that we could use to just apply some more lights into this concept. So let's just drag one of these out and go back to our scene. And I'm just going to drag this into here. I'm just going to move this back up just in case I need it. And in fact, what I'll do is I'm just going to drag all of these into our scene. There we go, and I'll just make copies of them. So there we go. Let's drag this one. I've actually got quite a few. I think we already did that one. Yeah, let's just do it again. Okay, so let's move all of these down. So let's start with this one. So Control T, free transform. And let's scale this out. And there's two ways that we can remove the darkness from this image and only keep the lights. We can either go to the settings here, so change this from normal to something like a screen or a color dodge. Or we can double click on this and use a blend if. So we could remove the darkness from the image, hold Alt to blend it. So it's going to blend in the image, and I really like using blend if. It seems to really help to remove those dark sections of the image. So we can use the underlying image and remove the darkness from what's behind it, or we can remove anything that's bright behind it as well. So I'm going to keep it as that. Oh, I've just pressed cancel. Let's do that again. There we go. So it might not line up perfectly, but some of these areas are actually looking pretty cool. So I quite like this one here. So anything else you can just delete. Let's say all of this section. You can either delete it or you can just move it. So use the lasso tool, move it around. Does it work anywhere else? Yeah, so it might look okay there. And we can still make some slight changes whilst it's selected. Press enter. And there we go. So this one, that's on top. I can press Control T. I can right click and use a skew just to try and match the perspective here. Maybe I'll put it on top of this building. And then enter. And just do the same thing throughout. Okay, so all of this might need to be changed. Let's remove this. Again, Control T. And then let's place it somewhere else. This is if you want to be really precise. If not, just use the eraser tool and just erase anything that you don't want. Okay, so actually I might keep that so it looks like a hologram between those two buildings. So let's keep that. Now anything that's going to be on top isn't going to have these lights. So I can go back into Blendiv, and anything that's bright on the underlying layer, I can move this forward and it's going to remove those lights. Okay. Anything that's darker, I can move this slider. So I'm just going to move this one and blend them in a little bit more. So now they're not touching the top surface. I can just use the eraser and erase anything I don't want. Again, go into that lasso tool if I need to move any of these lights. But as you can see, it's a really effective technique to apply these lights really quickly. Anywhere where it's starting to look a little bit messy, I just recommend just using the eraser and just erase that. Let's remove this one. I love these lines that's created by adding that original image. I feel like I'd want to kind of accentuate that within this design. So that's quite cool. Let's remove those lights. Let's make that a little bit straighter. And again, this is me just being a little bit nitpicky here. You don't have to do this. Okay, so that's just that one image, and to be honest, that's probably all you need. I might not actually need to use any of these other images. I don't think I like the contrast of that. You could go to image and then change the colors just to try and match the same color there, which is a little bit better. Let's try it anyway. I quite like the red lights that are on top of the building. So let's try a screen or a color dodge. Yeah, it might be quite nice just to add a little bit more of a saturated color there. So maybe some red lights on top of this building. Yes, I quite like this one there, but we would need to just skew it slightly. Skew the image just to try and match the perspective of our image underneath. So that's pretty cool. There we go. And yeah, it's starting to look really messy now, so we want to be careful that we don't start to lose a bit of information. Okay, we've got some really nice shapes here. We don't want to lose them. Let's delete the background. But I want to keep those lights there. That looks pretty cool. So it's always best to just turn your layer on and off. That's going to give you a good idea of what you need to delete. Okay. Now, although we've added the images, and like I said, you don't want to make all of these forms kind of glued together. So essentially all these shapes start to get lost and they start to blend together, which I'm kind of starting to see. I've also just noticed that this bit here isn't in perspective, which is going to annoy me, so I'm going to have to change it here. So let's Control T and skew it before I move on. Yeah, that's better. Let's erase that. But yeah, as you can see, if you squint your eyes, you're starting to see the brightness that's on top of the environment, and then everything else kind of just blurs into one. Yeah, it's not the best. So I'm going to create a new layer, and we're going to separate these forms a little bit more. So we're going to use this lasso tool or polygonal tool, and I'm just going to draw around these shapes. So you can be as precise as you want to be. For here, I'm just very loosely trying to match the same shape. I'm going to draw around this and then press Control H just so I can hide that selection. I'm going to go to a cooler color, let's say like a bright gray, and then select my airbrush or soft brush and then just lightly add some lights in this area. Okay, so I can use the eraser just to remove any of those hard edges. It might be a little bit too bright, so I'm just going to remove some of that brightness. But as you can see, we've just separated those forms. Now we've got a really nice defined silhouette here. Okay, whereas before it starts to blur in. The contrast here is very similar to this one. As soon as I add this separation, there's a clear difference there. So you can go totally crazy with this kind of technique. You can draw around all of it if you wanted to. If you want to separate these forms out, then you can do that. I'm only going to do this with a couple of them just to save time, not to bore you. So let's draw around this, back to the front, press enter, Control H just to hide that selection, and then again we'll just push this volume forward. Okay, so that's how we use that technique. And just because we've used it here within the midground doesn't mean that we can't use it in the background as well. So right here, I could draw around all of this and do the same thing. You could even change it so maybe there's a bit of a warmer light in the background. I could do a new layer just in case. Yeah, and see how that looks. Okay, so you're doing this just to separate those forms so you can build a stronger silhouette. It's really important that you split up all of these forms. Let's try another one here. Ooh. Oh, in fact, it's this one here. And this time I might use a new layer and select a, let's say, a purple or to pink. And let's make a light that kind of shoots up. So there's my initial light. I might want to just create a new layer and then draw a light that shoots up. And it could get brighter in the center. So something like that. Okay. And then I can just merge all of these down. Okay. And maybe there's another one right here. So another bit of light shooting up. Control H. And let's just do another one. I feel like it's a little bit right leaning here. Maybe let's do one around. Let's try this one. I think this is kind of blending in a little bit. So let's just mask around this. I think that's all actually part of one volume. So let's not do that. Let's do this one. Okay, as for the background, you can just use something like a magic wand tool. If it's not making that selection, then when you render this, that's why I mentioned having a black background instead. It's going to be a bit easier to cut these forms out. I'm just going to turn all of these layers off just so I can see what I'm working with. Let's do a quick selection. Is that going to be a bit better? It's a little bit better, but we still need to make some adjustments. I'm just holding Alt on the keyboard just to deselect. That's a little bit better, but it's not perfect. So we might need to clean this up afterwards. And we could just double click this background and delete that background there. And then we'll just apply a background image. So maybe one of these images might be okay. I'll just drag this behind. What does that do? That's naff. Let's try this one. What's this one look like? Way too dark. Oh, that might work. Let's Control T, drag this out. Okay. Let's turn my painted layers back on. And then let's try and push this further into the background. So we may need to use a color balance just to try and make this a little bit more blue and cyan. And then we could go to image and curves and just try and make this a bit brighter. So I'm just going to go back into this original image and cut out some of these areas that didn't cut out properly. That's a bit better. Yep, okay. Let's turn our lights back on. And I might just go back into our lights here and start to separate some more of these forms. So let's try this one. That's a bit better. And then we can just make an overall adjustment. So we can go and create a color balance just to try and blend these elements in a little bit more. We could either make this look very green, yeah, depending on what kind of environment you want to create. So this would be more of like a Blade Runner environment. It could be very kind of look like smog there, or we can make this very cool. I quite like how it looks. I don't know, actually. I think I quite like it a little bit green. And then we can go to highlights and make some more adjustments. And then we can adjust the shadows. So let's just see that before and after. We can also add a vignette, so we can go to curves and just bring this down. We could also add a little bit more contrast just by selecting a point in the middle, and then we can just tap in the center here just to try and bring your attention into the center. And there are other ways of color grading. You can use a gradient map. So you could select two different colors. So let's say you selected a dark blue for the shadows, and then some sort of, whoops, let's just cancel that. Some sort of orange warm light for the shadows. So for the lights, click OK. So you could do something like that, and then change the settings here. So that's quite interesting. I think lighten might be quite nice for that. It's giving that nice film look. Okay, so before the effects and after the effects. And you can go back and make more color adjustments if you feel you need to make some slight tweaks. So it might need to be a little bit warmer or cooler. So I'm just going to increase some of the reds here. There we go. And there's another adjustment you can make. You can either do a photo filter, which is just going to either make it warmer or cooler, or you can do a color lookup. This is essentially like a Instagram filter. So you might find some cool effects here that you want to use. Again, that really nice kind of Blade Runner look. Yeah, this is quite interesting. Let's just see. Sometimes it's a little bit too harsh, but you might just like the effect it has on the image. You can then go into opacity and just play around the opacity to see whether you want that tone. So in this case, there was a slight purple hue. I just do before and after. Does that look better? I think that actually looks quite good. Even if it's just very subtle, it looks a little bit better. So let's bring this down to about 10 and see how this looks. Yep, I quite like that. If you want to make some little adjustments to the original image, you can go to Control, Alt, Shift and E on the keyboard, and that's going to flatten the entire thing and put it directly on top. So we could go to something like the dodge tool, set it to midtones, and just increase some of these areas. So maybe I want a little bit more light here. Yeah, maybe the background is a little bit brighter. Right, so the last step, I want to add a slight grain to our image, just so it looks a little bit more like a film. So Control, Alt, Shift and E again. And I like to just add these onto separate layers. So I'm going to go to Add Noise. So Filter, Noise, Add Noise. And let's just zoom in and turn the preview on and off. So it's adding a slight noise to the entire image. So we can click OK there. And I'm also going to sharpen this. Let's see what a sharpen looks like. So Filter, Sharpen and Smart Sharpen. Yeah, it's going to bring out some of the edges a little bit more. So we can turn this off and on, and that looks okay. Maybe let's just bring it down slightly. Yeah, that's a bit better. So now those lights are really punchy. We can see them a lot better. Now let's add a slight chromatic aberration. So I'm going to just Control, Alt, Shift and E again, just as a final adjustment. Go to Filter, Lens Correction, and I'm going to add a slight distortion to the image. So if I zoom in by 200%, we can see that we've got these very nice crisp lines. If you go to Custom, and let's move this more towards red, more towards magenta, and more towards blue, we can see there's a slight green hue now, and you can kind of play around with these settings. Maybe you want a little bit more of a red edge. Basically, whenever you take an image with a DSLR, you get this slight chromatic aberration to it when you zoom in. Now, when you're doing a 3D render, you don't get any of that. So this is basically mimicking what a camera would do. So it makes it look a little bit more photorealistic. It also helps just blend in some of these painted and photo elements. So that's looking okay. Let's click OK there. It's a very small adjustment, but it's an adjustment nonetheless. And that's it. You know, we can go back into the dodge tool and we can start painting into it more. We could add more lights. Maybe if you wanted to add some sort of custom billboards here, then you could make them. I mean, let's just do that as an example. Whilst I am here, let's just have a look. So if I just type in, I don't know, burger, can I make a sign out of a burger? So let's try and find one that hasn't got a background. That one's not too bad. Might just make a small adjustment. No, that's very small. Burger King, you can't beat a nice Burger King. So let's just copy and paste this into the scene. And I'm trying to think on the fly how I'm actually going to do this. So this should be interesting. So I'm going to use that Magic Wand tool just to remove that white background. And let's make this a neon sign. So how would I do that? It's a good question, Rob. How would I do that? So I'm just going to duplicate this just in case. I might want to use the original. And I'm going to double click on this and remove the red channel. Yeah, I think that's already doing a pretty good job. Let's experiment with the green channel or the blue channel. So if you want to keep a lot of the colors, then you could do it that way. let's remove the red channel. So let's move this down. So let's say right here we've got an advertisement. So let's just, in fact, let's not do anything now. Let's not add a perspective. Let's just try and change this even more. So let's go back into this image. Oh, it's back up here, of course. Oh, okay, yeah, let's go back into this one and duplicate this. And this time, turn on the layer for start. Let's turn the green channel on, and then let's turn both of them on at the same time. So if I just move these to the side, yeah, we're starting to get that effect there. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And then we could also go to color balance and then just make some changes here. So let's just merge all these together. Let's see if this works. If I create a new layer and select all of these and then right click and merge layers, there we go, that's now merged. We can then again do some sort of color balance. All of this stuff is optional. I just thought it might be quite cool to show you this technique. Yes, we can play around with the highlights and the midtones. This might be a cool way of adding some sort of hologram. Now in this it's a little bit jarring. I would probably add these little holograms all over the entire scene, but this is just to show you how that can be done. Okay, so it could even be up here. Oh, it's making me hungry now. I haven't had a Burger King in ages, actually. You always hear people say, oh, KFC was closed, I had to have a Burger King, which is a shame because I love Burger King. But there we go. That is how we could add a hologram to our scene. So I hope you enjoyed that. That is the entire process of creating a displacement map, putting it into Keyshot, doing a render, and then painting into it in Photoshop. I think it's looking pretty cool, actually. So I hope you enjoyed that, and take care, and look forward to seeing you soon. Okay, goodbye.